Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to speak to you today. I'm obviously doing that from my living room in Hove in the UK on the south coast. For those of you that know the geography of the UK, but as you rightly said, I'm from the LSE. I'm going to talk about the fairness of some of the measures that were put into place and how we might properly account for their fairness or otherwise. And I want to talk about how, to start with, I want to talk about how we should be making policy in calmer times. Because, of course, we've obviously been faced with a pandemic, we've been faced with a health, economic, and social crisis, and policymakers responded largely in a state of panic. But I would argue that that makes it all the more important that we have a set of calm, reflective, and rational principles upon which to make our decisions, especially when we're faced with times of panic and times of crisis. And I want to talk about, in particular, I want to talk about the claims that different individuals or groups in society have on resources in calmer times at a time of crisis. Essentially, the priorities that different individuals and groups should be given when we're allocating scarce resources, or when we're making decisions that we know will necessarily cause harms to some people, whilst at the same time causing benefits to others. And I've talked variously over the last 18 months about how we might think about policy interventions as dropping a pebble into a pond. And what we've done with COVID is we've looked initially at the splash. Have these measures done what they've intended to for hospitalizations, deaths, and to some degree infection rates of COVID itself and only COVID, without looking at all of the possible ripple effects downstream caused for all of the things that you had on your slide just now by way of introduction. I don't want to talk about what I've spent most of my time this last year talking about how we need better measures of those impacts. What I want to talk about is the distribution of those effects. And in order to do that, I need to talk about the claims that different individuals and groups have on resources. Now, you can imagine this as being how high or hard you can put your hand up when we're making a decision to allocate resources or to make a policy decision in a particular way, for example, like lockdowns. The more you can put your hand up, the stronger your claim to be at the front of the queue in the allocation decision. And one of the most prominent claims on resources, it's right at the heart of cost benefit analysis, is that I have the biggest claim when I have the greatest capacity to benefit. When the expected benefits into the future of giving me resources will be greatest. So in a very simple, stylized example, if there's absolutely no benefit that would come at all from an intervention, then I might have a claim to something, but I certainly don't have a claim to the resources associated with that intervention. In contrast to somebody who might be able to live a long and a full life as a result of those resources. That's the first, and I wouldn't say most significant, but first and significant claim that any group or individual may have on resources. I should say, of course, in the context of COVID, that claim has largely been ignored. It's a very interesting question for those that are interested in the morality and the ethics of this, that actually to make any attempt over the last 18 months or so to raise the prospects of the capacity to benefit of the benefits that might come from particular interventions has almost been has been met with moral outrage. Now, I want to say absolutely clearly, it may be that we may have decided to do exactly the same things in exactly the same ways as we did, because we never know what the counterfactuals are. I found Martin's talk earlier on focus protection very, very compelling, but of course we have no counterfactuals. So we don't know, none of us, we should be very humble about what we think we know the right course of action would have been, because we don't know what the world would have otherwise looked like had we done something different. So we may have even decided to make the same choices in the same ways, but it's at least relevant to consider the fact that many of those, given the age profile of COVID that has been alluded to many times before, that many of those people that we have tried to limit the transmission risks and rates to prevent the hospitalizations and the deaths would have died within the next year or two. I think Neil Ferguson is on record as saying about half of the deaths would have been otherwise have happened in the next 12 months. Now, that's at least worthy of discussion when we're putting in place mitigation measures that will have significant consequences for other people in society that I'll come to talk about a bit more shortly. Capacity benefit, first claim, significant claim that in the context of COVID hasn't been discussed very much. What has been discussed is the second of three claims that I'm going to talk about. The second is again a prospective assessment of what happens into the future. This time not in the presence of intervention, but in the absence of intervention. What will happen to somebody if we don't do something for them? If we don't put them towards the front of the queue in the race for scarce resources? And this has been the direct and central focus of our COVID policy response. It's what's going to happen if we don't do something to those affected by COVID. And of course, that would result in hospitalisation and death for older people, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic before the vaccine became available. That's a severity of illness condition, right? So that's when you're thinking of resources into the future in the absence of treatment. If we don't do something for these populations, they will die. It can't have a more significant effect. So a very short-term, very immediate, very salient consequence from not allocating resources in ways that would prevent and limit exposure to COVID. That has been the central focus of the policy response. So the second of the three claims that I want to discuss has been almost entirely what's driven all that we've done in response to the pandemic. Now, the third and final claim that I want to discuss for the purposes of today is not just looking into the future prospectively at what happens in the presence and absence of treatment or interventions or lockdown, but what happens over the entire lifetime. It isn't just a snapshot in time that we should be looking at, because of course a pandemic can come at any point in anyone's life, but the entire lifetime that an individual experiences or is expected to experience. And here is where a notion called the fair innings argument is very much at play. The idea that you get greater priority the less of life that you have lived or could expect to live. We care about the welfare of children, or at least I thought we did before the responses to the pandemic, in part because there's a lot of benefit that will go into helping them into the future. That's the utilitarian cost benefit calculus. But significantly because they've had less already, as compared to someone who's had a long and a rich and a full life. Rich, I don't mean necessarily in wealth terms, rich in terms of health and well-being. If you had a long and a rich life, your priorities, your priority, your claim on resources, how high you could hold your hand up to be towards the front of the queue, is much smaller and lower because you've already had a lot. Now, we know from reliable data sources like the Office for National Statistics that the average age of a COVID death in the UK is slightly greater than the average life expectancy in the UK. So if you are 18 years old, for example, now in the UK, there is a 60% chance that you will die before you reach the age of the average COVID death in the UK. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about the policy measures that have been put in place to mitigate the harms of COVID, they are almost entirely measures that will cause significant damage to the life experiences and the life expectancies of younger people, and in particular, those younger people who probably have limited life experiences and limited life expectancies anyway. So think about that in distributional terms. Our response to COVID has represented the single biggest transfer across the generations that we've ever seen, from those who have the most, which is those who have been lucky enough to live long and full lives, towards them, away from those who have had and can expect to have the shortest and most limited lives. That is literally a Robin Hood in reverse. It's literally taking from the poor and giving to the rich. And I found it fascinating and troubling and frustrating, um, disappointing, it's made me angry over this last year that we haven't at least been able to have a proper grown-up discussion and conversation about those consequences and about that redistribution and about the fairness of it and whether it is legitimate, justified, and proportionate. Now, of course, we know there are many behavioural reasons that we know why that hasn't been the case, and I have a couple of papers on that, not least one recently with Amanda Henwood in Frontiers in Psychology, where we set out reasons why the power of the preserved life narrative has been so strong that it's meant that any attempts to even have these kinds of discussions have been met with, as I say, moral outrage, or you've been sort of shouted down quite imminently by those who have been most in favour of lockdown measures, because they feel like they're doing the right thing, and the narrative reinforces that. I don't want to get into those behavioural effects too much, and I'm conscious of time and allowing opportunity for discussion. So let me reiterate and emphasise this point. If you think the claims on resources from individuals and societies ought to some large degree be governed by their lifetime prospects, which seems an eminently sensible thing to say, and by the way, is supported by a considerable amount of empirical evidence from public preference data, from surveys, from work that I've conducted in my earlier academic life, and actually over the course of the last 18 months, where the support for the fair innings argument is still every bit as strong as it's always been. People care about death. They especially care about death amongst younger people. They especially care about death amongst younger people who have had limited life experiences. Now, I know that the polling data has suggested strong support for lockdowns. I think those data are spurious, because people are never presented with the opportunity cost of lockdown. It's like lockdowns are a free lunch. Well, of course, everyone votes for a free lunch. But when you start introducing the cost of the food, the cost of the lockdown, then people become much, much less willing to support those measures. We know that, and there are plenty of data out there that will now be gathered. And I heard Martin mention Collateral Global earlier. It's an endeavour that I'm also involved in. We are seeking to gather up many of the impacts of the lockdown and mandated non-pharmaceutical interventions from around the world to show some of these effects. We're already seeing that lockdowns have disproportionately affected families on low incomes, that the domestic violence rates have increased for those at risk, that school closures will further widen attainment gaps. Social distancing measures have caused greatest harm for those with pre-existing mental health conditions, those whose well-being started off lower in the first place, younger people, women, children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Notice that all of these are groups for whom their lifetime prospects of well-being are short enough anyway. And that all that we've done with all the measures that we put in place is further curtail the limited life expectancies and life experiences of those already who have the least. And I find it interesting, again, and frustrating, and it makes me angry that there hasn't been a proper grown-up discussion about these consequences. Now, I know that many people will argue, well, these are transient, these are temporary. Of course, death is permanent, and some of these effects are transitory. And they're right to some degree. Some of the harms that we've caused to younger people, to children, will be things that they will bounce back from. Some of them will bounce back. Many people bounce back. We're a very adaptable species. We get over stuff, most things that life throws at us, quite quickly. But not all of us all of the time, and not those who are already facing challenge. Some of the mental effects, some of the mental health effects won't be readily restored. There's a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by Gwynteller and colleagues showing exactly that for those that already are suffering, lay on another heap of suffering, and the degree and extent to which they'll bounce back from that is significantly curtailed. We know that the tens of thousands of children that have gone missing from our schools in the UK, from the school closures, they're not at home in nice middle-class households working on Zoom. They've literally disappeared from school to join county line gangs, and actually, frankly, we don't know where they've gone. Most of those are not going to have fairy tale endings. Their lives are going to be significantly and permanently adversely affected by the measures that we put in place to mitigate COVID. So I want to conclude with a very clear observation and recommendation that we must do better in the future. That any public inquiry into COVID that takes place in the UK and elsewhere must properly consider the processes by which we made the decisions to do the things that we did, and whether and in what ways we can, in the future, more properly and fully account for the full range of impacts that policy measures have on all those affected, particularly the most vulnerable members of our populations. We have dropped the biggest pebble of intervention into the pond with these lockdown measures over the last year or more. And we haven't even done a very good job of capturing the splashes. We've done hardly anything at all at capturing ripple effects, and we've literally done nothing to consider the distributional consequences of those splashes and those ripples. I find that understandable for the first few weeks or months. I find it intolerable and inexcusable for the best part of the last year. So we need to ensure, as we move forward, if I'm trying to finish on a more positive and upbeat note, we need to ensure that we embed good practice of economic appraisal to some degree, cost benefit analysis insofar as it's possible to some extent. Sunetra and Martin and others have talked about the models that have been used to make the decisions. They're very crude models. We can have very crude models of economic impact and social impact and health impact. They should form part of the policy making process right at the beginning, not just later or even at all, just right from the beginning, right from when we start planning the future responses to pandemics, because we're going to have another one, and a future one at some point may be much more serious for the direct health effects of younger people, for example. We need to be ready to respond properly to that, and that requires us to be able to have a framework in place that will enable us to capture all the ripple effects as well as those initial splashes, and to do precisely what I'm suggesting here, is to capture the claims that different groups have on resources, and to properly account for the fact that those with the greatest claims will be those that have the least prospects for a good and long life. And that has been completely at odds with the policy responses to the current pandemic. Thank you.
And thank you.